time over, let's welcome Gary Chartier as our speaker today, okay?
You were never in it, Jim. Don't worry. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of a conversation with one of the thriving and vibrant chapters of the Association of Adventist Forums. You know, it's we often think of the National Forum organization primarily in terms of intermittent conferences and, of course, Spectrum. And it's easy, if one isn't in the vicinity of a congregation like this, of a forum chapter like this, to forget about the fact that we really are talking about an association of Adventist forums, and that the local organizations really are the center, are the heart of this community within the Adventist Church. It's always gratifying to me when I think about what happens in this group and the tremendous energy and enthusiasm that Jim and others have invested in it, make it just a great group of people to interact with, and it's something I'm proud to be within driving distance of. So what I want to do today is talk briefly with you about the analogy of love. The book that Jim mentioned that I published a couple of years ago, which really is an attempt to sketch out the contours of a systematic theology organized around love and using love as a criterion or a critical control on theological formulation, criterion for critical control on theological formulation. It's a mid-sized book with a fair amount of small type, and I don't want to try to reproduce all of the individual arguments. What I do want to do is give you a sense of the whole project, and then we can certainly talk about specific issues if that would be helpful. I started thinking about this topic sometime in the late 1990s. In the early 1990s, I'd finished the rough draft of a systematic theology that had a very different organizational structure. It was an exposition of the Apostles' Creed. One of my graduate school professors at Cambridge observed with respect to a project of his own of this kind that he was planning to go write that book on the creed that every theologian writes by age 60. And lacking imagination, I thought I would get mine done sooner. And so I produced a book on the Apostles' Creed and discovered that indeed every other theologian had written a book on this topic. And so, in fact, it just wasn't something that publishers were waiting to snap up, despite the obvious insight and perspicacity of my own version. So it sat on the shelf for a while. And in the course of my education, I'm not sure at what stage this happened, but I engaged with a book called Theology of Hope by the German Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann. And as Moltmann lays out the nature of his project at the beginning of this book, he talks about the fact that in early Christian history, he said, say through the Middle Ages, we had theologies of love. Then the Reformation gave us theologies of faith. And now, said Moltmann, it's time for us to have a theology of hope. And he intended this, of course, to reflect the desire for an active engagement with movements of social change that were very much alive in Europe at the time he was writing. That was kind of a neat typology, and I'm sure it's never been entirely accurate as a matter of history. But I filed this away, and I thought, you know, if Moltmann's right, and nobody's really done anything with theologies of love for a while, it seems like this might be a helpful thing for us to explore. As some people here know, my doctoral dissertation focused on the idea of friendship. Now, I wasn't using friendship as a kind of organizing principle for theology. I wasn't using it as a metaphor. I was looking theologically in a fairly concrete way at the experience of close interpersonal relationships. But I'd had to start thinking about that matter. I'd written a fair amount of stuff, which has now been published in law reviews rather than in theology, but a fair amount of stuff about divorce. And so again, I'd had to think about love in the context of marriage. And so issues about love and friendship were floating around in my psyche, and I thought, you know, here's a way to repackage this material. What happens if I rearrange, rethink what I've got here, and focus on love as the organizing center for theology? But I also realized that it wasn't just a matter of organization, but that I had been employing, probably without really being very deliberate about it, very self-conscious about it, I had also been employing love as a critical principle in theology. And some of this I had picked up from my advisor in graduate school, Brian Hebblethwaite. To some extent, it was just a matter of some reading I had done. But I realized this was an underlying norm that had been really quite important for me that I hadn't necessarily caused myself to focus on at all. So thought, well, let's do both things. Let's lay out a theology that is organized around love so that each of the principal loci of Christian doctrine are shown to connect with the theme of love. And at the same time, let's show at appropriate places how love constrains what we can say theologically. So that's what I tried to do in this book. Now, I guess the first thing to say is that love is a big umbrella term. It's got a lot of different nuances, a lot of different flavors, and it's become a sort of de rigueur in the 20th century to articulate, again, typologies of love. So Anders Nygren famously gave us a book called Agape and Eros, distinguishing between divine love, which reaches down in the manner of a gift, and human love, which at its best reaches up in desire toward that which can meet its needs, that which can fill whatever vacuum it's got to confront. C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves talked about a range of loves, agape and eros, but also philia, which is the word that we often translate friendship, and storge and epithemia, and you know, it's because there's a growth industry here. I want to suggest that it is mischievous to spend a great deal of time trying to sharply parse distinctions between these varieties of love. So, for instance, despite the enormous enthusiasm that there's been for distinguishing agape and eros, one scholar whose work I appreciate very much, who's trained in classics as well as in philosophy, Stephen Clark, observes that classicists who read what Christian theologians say about the meaning of agape in Greek are puzzled. They just don't recognize this as really having anything very much to do with what they think is really going on when ordinary people in classical Greek at any rate use this language. One writer I read years ago made the acid observation, I think drawing maybe even on the 19th century Calvinist scholar Benjamin Warfield, that if we look at the Septuagint, which obviously doesn't predate the New Testament by that much, we find that when Esau is said to desire his mess of pottage, the word that's used there is a cognate of agape. He has agape for his stew. The point here being that it's just not at all clear that we can clearly distinguish, even in the classical Greek environment in which we're supposed to find all of these distinctions neatly mapped out, a sharp distinction among any of these. The reality is that love has to do, I think, with what we might call in very general terms a kind of positive orientation on the other, and that includes respect, respect for the particularity and otherness of the other. It includes desire. It includes compassion. It includes a whole range of appreciation for the beauty of the other as something independent of oneself, a whole range of different overlapping meanings. And I'm not particularly interested in having my argument trade on some very fine, careful, precise distinction. I think all of these different meanings are in play when we talk about love, and I think we have to begin with that recognition. Now, somebody, of course, could say, well, but Christian love is different from all these other sorts of love. And that's a perfectly possible position to articulate, but I think what really happens when you say that is you're starting to evacuate love of content if you suggest that the kind of love we're talking about here is utterly unlike the sort of love that people experience in the rest of their lives. That's what gives us the title here, The Analogy of Love, and so that's perhaps the place to begin, as if we hadn't already begun. The Christian tradition has wrestled in a very profound way with the difficulty of making sense of talk about God, right? Because God does not present God's self for inspection. God is not a finite bit of a bit of reality. God is not, as the great 20th century Austrian Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner used to say, it's not as if God is the sort of reality one might stumble upon, as a set of explorers might come over the horizon and find Australia waiting for them. God isn't part of our visual field. And so because of this, because God is infinite, because God always exceeds our conceptual and linguistic and experiential grasp, the challenge of actually making our language about God accountable to the reality of God is a problem, right? God is bigger than we are, infinitely so. God is not simply a kind of big friendly part of the universe. God transcends the universe. The late English Dominican Herbert McCabe once defined theology as watching your language in the presence of God. And it seems to me that challenge, the challenge of how we're going to watch our language in the presence of God, how we're going to ask about the accountability of our language to this utterly incomprehensible, transcendent reality that is God. This is the challenge that prompted the Christian tradition to explore various models of analogical thinking. At the time, this might not have been cast this way, but I think what's happened over time, in retrospect, people have read this enterprise of trying to think about how to connect our language with the reality of God. People have cashed this out in terms of two models or two approaches, which are obviously ideal types. And we can talk about the analogy of being and the analogy of faith. And so, roughly speaking, with all sorts of qualifiers in place for anybody who's more historically literate than I am and than I think we need to be for this purpose, the analogy of faith seeks to proceed toward talk about God on the basis of what is seen to be God's vouchsafed revelation. Special revelation, where the analogy of being seeks to make our language about God accountable to the reality of God by building on the nature of God's creation. Okay? So it would be too simple to say that this was a distinction between revealed and natural theology or between special and general revelation, but clearly it tracks that distinction, okay? So I think it's fairly obvious that there are things that are attractive about both of these approaches. There are things that might make us seek a knowledge about God both in terms of the particular traditions that we identify with as Christians, and also the broad knowledge of human experience and the dynamics of created life that a more general engagement with the world might lead us to take seriously. Both of these things matter. But they've very often been treated as opposed to each other, and sometimes this is cast as a Protestant Catholic distinction. Karl Barth, the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century and one of the greatest in history, made a great deal of this distinction, and indeed this way of putting the matter as a matter of distinction between the analogy of being and the analogy of faith really comes to us courtesy of Barth. Whether he's dependent on other folks, I don't know. But in any event, the analogy of love, I suggest, is a way of getting past this dichotomy. And that's a suggestion I make toward the beginning of the book. The analogy of love says, let's take our experience of love, subject it to reflective, critical assessment, but let's make that the central analogy for our talk about God. On the one hand, this is a piece very much of the natural world. Love can involve and lead to self-transcendence and so forth, but it still seems very much to be a piece of the ordinary world, whether we think about parental love or filial love, spousal love, whatever. Love seems to be very much part of our embodied natural existence. At the same time, it is clear that love gets as much of an imprimatur from the Christian tradition as the central category for our talk about love as any category could. And we can run through a whole list of biblical passages which repeatedly use love talk to make sense of God. John 3:16 obviously is the most memorable, but we could identify a wide range of passages in both the First Testament and the New Testament that zero in on God as love. Okay, so I suggest then that it would be a great place to start if our theology focused on love in two ways. If on the one hand, love served as the source of architectural organization for our theology, so that we could show that each central doctrine was a doctrine about both divine love and human love for God and for other creatures. And at the same time, that we could ask of any given doctrine, is this doctrine worth taking seriously? How do we know? Well, one way we can tell is whether it is consistent with, first, our conviction that God is love, and second, our recognition of the central value of love for other creatures and God on our part. So here, one fairly obvious example which I owe to the Protestant philosopher Thomas Talbot. Thomas Talbot is a guy who I think must have been raised among Calvinists, and so he was raised with belief in double predestination. Double predestination, you will recall, is the notion that some people are saved and some people are damned, and that God decides simply on the basis of God's own arbitrary will who fits in which category. And those people who are damned according to at least kind of scholastic Calvinism, to the glory of God. Okay? Indeed, some of you may be aware there was a fairly, I think, pathological movement in 18th century American Christianity in which Calvinist evangelists asked folks, are you willing to be damned for the glory of God? Because, of course, if you were willing to be damned for the glory of God, this meant that you really had the kind of detachment from your own well-being and the kind of concern for God's glory, which, of course, would be very good evidence that God had, in fact, elected you to salvation. So there's just something very perverse about that. But anyway, so Thomas Talbot, in any event, asks the question, so I go into my sleeping child's room, and I ask myself, is she among the elect, or has God destined her for damnation? Can I, says Talbot, can I really say that I love my neighbor as myself if I am also willing that my sleeping child be damned? And Talbot thinks, and I think he's right, that the answer to this is fairly clearly no. And so Talbot draws from this the conclusion, which I would want enthusiastically to endorse, that I cannot simultaneously affirm the Golden Rule and affirm double predestination. The Golden Rule is more central to Christian life and faith, therefore I ought to reject double predestination. Now, I think the point here is that the debate about, for instance, double predestination often gets carried on in terms of, a fairly elaborate structure of theological conviction or fairly arcane matters of biblical exegesis. And what Talbot is saying is, whatever else you say, if you can't say this, if you can't say, I affirm this doctrine and affirm the Golden Rule at the same time, then probably I ought not to affirm this doctrine. And that, I think, is the kind of approach that I want to take throughout the book. So, for instance, then, how does the model work? What does the model look like? So the book involves a tour through the familiar loci of Christian systematic theology. So love, for instance, is seen as underlying the doctrine of creation in a whole host of ways. Creation involves the bringing into existence of intelligent, reflective creatures who can engage in loving relationships with God and with each other. That's love as a matter of seeking fellowship. At the same time, their very existence enriches the world and enriches the divine life, and this can be seen as a matter of divine desire. Creation is the ground, I think, of Christian ethics, and to talk about what it is to be a good person and to act justly and appropriately is a matter in a variety of ways of loving. We need to talk a lot more about what that means, but in any event, I think that's central. Similarly, we can talk about sin as a matter of disordered love, as a matter perhaps of inaccurately perceiving that which is loved, as a matter of idolatrously absolutizing one's love for one piece of creation over another, as a matter perhaps of insufficiently loving oneself or loving some other aspect of the creation, as the case may be. So love, I think, certainly figures there. I think we ought to talk about the church as a community of love. And clearly, there are some people in thriving, healthy congregations for whom this will seem natural and obvious, and others for whom it is probably a pathetic joke, right? I mean, obviously, the notion that the church is a loving, embracing community ought to be as natural to us as anything we say as Christians, and yet it seems fairly clear that the differences between healthy congregations where this kind of ideal is embodied and congregations that are deeply distorted and pathetic, that's a very striking difference. But I think it's real. I think it's important. I think it is a crucial piece of what Christians have to say. So I argue for a variety of ways in which we might think about the church as loving and beloved community. I suggest that we might even think about the traditional tests for the integrity of the true church, which has characteristically been framed as a matter of the church as being the place where the gospel is preached and the sacraments are administered. We might rethink that in terms of love in one way or another, that the test of doctrinal orthodoxy that is perhaps rightly or wrongly applied to proposals offered within the church might well be a test of consistency with love, and so forth. So I try to spell this out in relation to a variety of theological loci. I'm very happy during the question and answer session to talk Turkey about how this works in particular contexts, what a love-centered theology might look like. But I just want to talk right now about one cluster of important issues that runs through the book. And after I've talked about that, I'm happy for us to begin our conversation in a more appropriately two-way manner. It seems to me that if we're going to do responsible theology that talks about God as love, then there is an unavoidable constraint on our theological formulations, which is the need to respond appropriately to the problem of evil, okay? Whatever else we say about God and the world, we have to begin with the recognition that there's all sorts of awful stuff in the world. And each of us experiences awful stuff ranging from petty betrayals and so forth, all the way to civilization-destroying awfulness, violence, war, disease, and disaster. Okay, this is an inescapable piece of our experience. We can't deny it without, I think, descending into insanity. So, how are we going to think about that? How are we going to fit that into a responsible theology? Well, I don't think we can do it in a couple of ways. I'm just going to have to breeze past complicated issues here in the interest of time. That's also an excuse for not necessarily always being able to say everything as well or as clearly as I would like. I think it's not okay, for instance, to deny the reality of evil. And this is, in some sense, a more popular approach among Christians and some other theists than you might imagine. They don't deny it by saying that it didn't really happen, for instance, but it is quite common to say, well, but if you really understood how this tragedy fit into the big picture, you'd see that it wasn't really a tragedy. I think that borders on the obscene, because I think if you really imagine yourself pastorally saying this to somebody who's undergone a tragic loss, I think there's something deeply disturbing about that. I think it doesn't ring true. And what it suggests instead is that somehow God is in the business of causing bad things in order to bring about good things. And it seems to me this is fairly troubling on a whole host of levels. But then we also have other kinds of perhaps even more disturbing views that enjoy some currency, views that, for instance, talk about it's being the case that somehow the destructive things that happen in the world are punishments. Particularly disgusting spectacle here. You may remember Pat Robertson et al. In the wake of the September 11 attacks, suggesting that somehow God had caused or permitted these events to happen in retribution for American cultural laxity. It's all the fault of the gays. It's just a deeply, deeply troubling way of looking at things, and I think very inconsistent with belief in God as love. I want to suggest, again, without working through the details here, that what these sorts of views seem to deny, and what I think we have to, by contrast, affirm, what I think we have to take very seriously, is that the fact of evil in the world is very good evidence that God's will is very often not done. And how you understand that, what kind of background account of divine action in the world you give in light of that, I think is another matter, and there's a lot more to be said about that. But what I think you have to recognize is that God's intentions are very often not realized. Creatures, all the way from us to much lower level elements of the created world, say no to God, okay? And so you've got to have a picture of divine action that is consistent with that recognition. So your overall theological account of things, I think, has to be an account which recognizes that it cannot be supposed that just because we can attribute some good intention to God, it can therefore be assumed that God has realized or will realize that good intention. Again, this shows up in a wide variety of contexts. It certainly affects how we think about prayer. It has to do with how we think about the nature of the Bible, about the nature of God's revelatory activity and providential activity in history generally. And I suggest that if we don't take this seriously, if we continue to act as if some sort of Calvinism that allows for a kind of absolute divine sovereignty to be affirmed in all contexts, if we continue to act as if that's the case, then I think everything else we say theologically is going to be inconsistent with our affirmation of God as love and is going to be utterly untrue to our experience. So, part of framing then a theology as love-centered is going to be recognizing that if we're going to say that God is love, while recognizing how awful things are at some times and in some places in the world, then we have to recognize that divine love can be safeguarded, can be confidently affirmed only with a very careful and nuanced account of what can be expected from divine providence. That's one example of the many things that I want to say here, but it provides a context for a lot of others. So the bottom line, I think, is this is a project designed to show us what a love-centered theology might look like in practice. There are all sorts of issues in the book that I haven't, there are all sorts of issues that I haven't pursued in the book, all sorts of issues that I've just grazed past, and certainly many that I haven't talked about here yet, though I'm happy to engage with you about in the course of our conversation as the afternoon continues. What I want to emphasize, in any event, though, is that a theology that is centered on divine love and human love is a theology that is simultaneously true to the best in the Christian tradition and I think to the best in our own experience, and that seems to me to be something worth celebrating. So, that's all I think I want to say by way of introduction. What I'd like to do is to begin a full-fledged conversation with you. I don't know if that's a good reason to start recording on a different CD. I also know that it is sometimes the case that questions are collected here, and I don't know if that's happened, but Jim, perhaps you can provide me with some guidance.